My name is Daniel Reed. I'm 28 years old and I work the night shift at Magnolia Rest Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. If you've never been to Savannah, let me tell you something. This city breathes ghosts. The moss hangs from the oak trees like funeral shrouds. The cobblestone streets remember the footsteps of Confederate soldiers, and the air itself feels thick with the weight of 300 years of death. But nowhere in this haunted city is as dark as the place where I work 5 nights a week. From 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., watching over the dead and following a set of rules that make absolutely no sense until you break one. I took this job 6 months ago, right after my life fell apart in spectacular fashion. My fiancée Sarah left me when she found out I'd been lying about having a job for 4 months, burning through our savings while pretending to go to work every day at an accounting firm that had actually laid me off. The shame of that discovery, the look in her eyes when she realized the man she was going to marry was a coward and a liar, still haunts me more than anything I've seen in this cemetery. She took the apartment, the dog, and every shred of dignity I had left. I moved into a cramped studio above a vape shop on Congress Street, surviving on ramen and rejection emails from every legitimate employer in the city. That's when I saw the posting on a dimly lit community board at the all-night laundromat where I was washing my clothes at 2 a.m. because I couldn't sleep. Night caretaker wanted. Magnolia Rest Cemetery. $350 per night cash. Must be reliable and able to follow instructions precisely. No experience necessary. There was a phone number written in faded ink and nothing else. $350 a night cash, 5 nights a week. That's over $7,000 a month for basically wandering around a graveyard with a flashlight. It seemed too good to be true, which in my experience usually means it is. But I was 2 weeks from eviction and down to my last $100. I called the number the next morning. A woman answered, her voice rough and tired like she'd been smoking unfiltered cigarettes since the Eisenhower administration. Her name was Eleanor Blackwood, and she was the cemetery's director, though she preferred the title keeper. She asked me 3 questions. Could I follow instructions without deviation? Was I comfortable being alone in the dark? And did I believe in ghosts? I said yes to the first 2 and laughed nervously at the third, saying I'd never really thought about it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "You will. Be here tonight at 9:45 p.m. Gate will be open. Look for the maintenance shed near the chapel. I'll be waiting." I showed up 15 minutes early, parking my dying Honda Civic outside the wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to Magnolia Rest. The cemetery sprawled across 20 acres of what used to be a plantation, and you could still see the original plantation house's foundation near the back corner, now just a rectangle of moss-covered bricks that nobody wanted to build on. Spanish moss hung so thick from the oak trees that it created natural curtains between the graves, and in the amber glow of the old gas lamps that lined the main path, the whole place looked like a movie set for a Southern Gothic horror film, which, as I would soon learn, wasn't far from the truth. Eleanor was waiting by the shed, a small wooden building painted dark green that looked like it had been there since the cemetery's founding in 1846. She was exactly what I expected, late 60s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a long black dress that would have looked perfectly at home in a Victorian mourning portrait. Her eyes, though, were what caught me off guard. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and they looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like she could see every lie I'd ever told, every mistake I'd ever made. "Daniel Reed," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "You're desperate, you're alone, and you have nowhere else to go. That makes you perfect for this job." She handed me a heavy brass key ring with 3 keys on it: shed, chapel, and front gate. "You'll need all 3 during your shifts." Then she pulled out a laminated card from her dress pocket, the kind you might use for a recipe or a library card, and handed it to me. "These are the rules. You will follow them exactly as written, without exception, without question, and without deviation. Do you understand?" I took the card and looked down at it under the shed's porch light. Written in neat, precise handwriting were 8 rules. Rule 1, never acknowledge the woman in the white dress, no matter what she says or does. Rule 2, if you hear children laughing between midnight and 3 a.m., immediately go to the shed and lock yourself inside until the laughter stops. Rule 3, do not look at the western wall between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you must pass that area, keep your eyes on the ground. Rule 4, if anyone asks you for help finding a grave, check their feet. If they cast no shadow under the lamplight, give them incorrect directions to the eastern section. Rule 5. The chapel must remain locked at all times. Do not open it under any circumstances, even if you hear someone calling for help from inside. Rule 6. If your vehicle's lights turn on by themselves, do not approach it. Return to the shed and wait until your shift ends. Rule 7. There is a grave marked with a red painted X in the northeast corner. Do not read the inscription. Do not touch the headstone. Do not linger near it. Rule 8. If you smell fresh roses at any time during your shift, you are being followed. Do not turn around for exactly 10 minutes. Count slowly. I looked up from the card, trying to process what I'd just read, trying to determine if this was some kind of elaborate hazing ritual for new employees. Eleanor's face was completely serious. No hint of humor or mockery in those pale eyes. These rules aren't suggestions, Daniel. They're not cemetery policies or company guidelines. They are survival instructions. The previous caretaker, a young man named Tommy Bridger, lasted 3 weeks before he violated Rule 5. We found his uniform folded neatly outside the chapel door. We never found Tommy. My mouth went dry. What do you mean you never found him? Did he quit? I mean exactly what I said. Now you start your patrol at 10 p.m. Walk the main paths, check that no gates have been left open. Ensure no one is lingering after visiting hours. You have a flashlight in the shed, along with a radio that doesn't work but you should carry anyway. There's a thermos of coffee and a sandwich in the small refrigerator. You're welcome to eat whenever you like, but I recommend staying in the shed between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. regardless of the rules. That hour is the worst. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Daniel? The rules are in order of importance. Breaking Rule 1 might just make your shift uncomfortable. Breaking Rule 8 will change your life forever. And breaking Rule 5? She looked back at me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Breaking Rule 5 means you won't have a life to change. Then she walked into the darkness beyond the gas lamps, and I heard the sound of a car engine starting somewhere in the parking lot outside the gates. I was alone in Magnolia Rest Cemetery with a flashlight, a ring of keys, and a laminated card full of rules that made no sense. I checked my phone, 9:53 p.m., 7 minutes until my shift officially started. I stood there under the shed's porch light, reading the rules again. And that's when I heard it for the first time, a woman's voice, soft and sad, calling out from somewhere between the graves. "Excuse me, sir? I'm lost.
Can you help me find my way home?"
I turned toward the voice instinctively, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw her. She was standing about 30 yards away, just beyond the reach of the nearest gas lamp, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow with its own pale light. The dress was old-fashioned, something from the 1800s maybe, with a high collar and long sleeves, and it moved slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Her face was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Pale skin, dark hair, and eyes that were completely black. No whites at all, just two pools of absolute darkness set in a lovely face. She was smiling at me, a sad, knowing smile that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. I looked down at the laminated card in my hand. Rule 1. Never acknowledge the woman in the white dress, no matter what she says or does. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. But I forced myself to look away from her, to walk into the shed and close the door behind me. Through the small window I could see her still standing there, watching the shed, her head tilted slightly to one side like a curious bird. She raised one pale hand and waved at me slowly, then turned and walked away into the darkness between the graves, her white dress trailing behind her like mist. I spent the first hour of my shift sitting in the shed, drinking terrible coffee and trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the woman was just some local kid playing a prank, that the completely black eyes were just a trick of the shadows and my overactive imagination. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that Eleanor's warnings weren't hazing or superstition. They were real. At 11 p.m., I finally forced myself to start my patrol. The cemetery was laid out in a rough grid, with the main path running north to south and smaller paths branching off to the east and west. The graves nearest to the entrance were the newest modern granite headstones with fresh flowers and solar-powered lights shaped like angels. As you walked deeper into the cemetery, the graves got older, the headstones more elaborate. with stone angels and weeping willows and marble crosses that had been weathered by 150 years of Georgia rain. The oldest section, in the northeast corner where Rule 7's red X grave was located, contained markers from the 1840s and 1850s, simple stones with names and dates worn almost smooth by time. I walked slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the paths, checking the small iron gates that separated different family plots. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, just rows of silent graves under ancient oak trees and a sky full of stars. I was starting to relax, starting to think that maybe tonight would be quiet when I heard it. Children laughing. High-pitched, joyful, completely out of place in a cemetery at 11:30 p.m. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing between the graves, growing louder with each passing second. I looked at my phone. 11:32 p.m. Rule 2 said if I heard children laughing between midnight and 3 a.m., I should go to the shed immediately. But it wasn't midnight yet. Did the rule only apply to that specific time window? Or was I supposed to run any time I heard children? I stood frozen on the path, the laughter growing closer, and made a decision that I thought was reasonable at the time. I'd wait and see if the laughter continued past midnight. And if it did, I'd head to the shed then. The laughter stopped abruptly at 11:47 p.m., cutting off mid-giggle like someone had pressed a mute button. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I continued my patrol, checking the western and eastern sections, staying far away from the chapel that sat in the center of the cemetery, a small Gothic revival structure with boarded-up windows and a door secured with not just a lock, but also heavy chains wrapped around the handles. Even from a distance, the chapel made me uncomfortable. There was something wrong about it, something that made the air around it feel heavier, colder, even though the September night was warm and humid. At 12:15 a.m., I heard the children laughing again. This time I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the shed, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the main path, and I could swear I heard small footsteps running behind me, matching my pace, getting closer. I reached the shed, fumbled with the key and got inside just as something small hit the door hard enough to rattle it in its frame. The laughter continued outside, right up against the walls of the shed, and I could hear little hands scratching at the wood, at the windows, testing the door handle. I sat in the corner farthest from the door, my back against the wall, my flashlight clutched in one hand and my phone in the other, watching the windows and waiting for something to break through. The scratching and laughing continued for 23 minutes according to my phone's timer, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to look out the window. The cemetery was empty and silent again, just shadows and moonlight and the soft sound of wind moving through the Spanish moss. The rest of that first night passed without incident, though I violated Rule 3 without meaning to. At 2:27 a.m., while doing my patrol of the southern section, I forgot about the rule and glanced toward the western wall, a tall brick barrier that separated the cemetery from the marsh beyond it. What I saw made me wish I'd kept my eyes on the ground. Standing along the top of the wall, perfectly still and perfectly silent, were dozens of figures, men, women, children, all dressed in clothes from different time periods, all staring directly at me with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like animals' eyes in the dark. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching me with an intensity that felt almost hungry. I quickly looked away and hurried back to the main path, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched by dozens of eyes. Eleanor returned at 6 a.m. sharp, pulling up to the gate in an old black Lincoln Town car that looked like it had been purchased during the Carter administration. I was waiting by the shed, exhausted and shaken, but still in one piece. She looked me over carefully, then nodded with what might have been approval. "You followed the rules," she said. "That's good. Most people can't resist the temptation to break at least one on their first night." She handed me an envelope thick with cash, $350 in 20s and 10s. "Same time tomorrow night. The rules don't change, but the cemetery does. Stay alert." I went back to my apartment and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman in the white dress or the figures standing on the wall, or imagined small hands scratching at my window. I finally gave up around 2 p.m. and spent the afternoon researching Magnolia Rest Cemetery online. What I found didn't make me feel any better about returning that night. The cemetery had a dark history that went back to its founding. Built on land that had been used as a burial ground for enslaved people during the plantation era, the cemetery was established in 1846 by a man named Silas Blackwood, probably Eleanor's ancestor, who had been obsessed with spiritualism and the idea of communicating with the dead. He'd conducted seances in the chapel, trying to reach his dead wife, and according to local legends, he'd succeeded in opening some kind of doorway that was never properly closed. In 1867, during the yellow fever epidemic that killed thousands in Savannah, the cemetery's caretaker, a man named Nathaniel Cross, had gone mad and killed his entire family before hanging himself from one of the oak trees. In 1923, a group of teenagers had broken into the chapel on a dare, and all four of them had been found the next morning wandering the streets of downtown Savannah with no memory of the previous 12 hours and identical burns on their palms in the shape of handprints that were too small to be human. In 1984, the cemetery had been the site of a series of grave robberies, but the perpetrators were never caught, and the disturbed graves were found arranged in strange patterns that police couldn't explain. And most recently, in 2019, a woman named Catherine Wells had been found dead inside the cemetery, though the gates had been locked and there was no evidence of how she'd gotten in or what had killed her. The autopsy had listed cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest due to extreme fear. I showed up for my second shift with a sense of dread that had only grown stronger throughout the day. Eleanor was waiting again, and this time she handed me a small paper bag along with my keys. "Sage and salt," she said when I looked at her questioningly. "Keep them in your pockets. They won't stop anything, but they might slow it down if things go wrong." That was not reassuring. I asked her what she meant by it, but she just shook her head and walked away, leaving me alone once again with my flashlight and my rules and my growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake taking this job. The second night started the same as the first. The woman in the white dress appeared around 10:15 p.m., this time standing directly on the main path about 20 feet in front of me. She was close enough that I could see details I'd missed the night before. Her dress wasn't just white. It was a wedding dress, elaborate and expensive, with lace and pearls and a long train that pooled on the ground around her feet. Her black eyes were fixed on mine and she was speaking, though I couldn't hear her words at first. I remembered Rule 1 and immediately looked down at my feet, refusing to acknowledge her. But she started walking toward me, gliding really, her feet not quite touching the ground, and her voice grew louder with each step she took. "Daniel," she said, and hearing my name in her voice made my blood run cold. "Daniel Reed, I know you. I know what you did. I know about Sarah. I know about the lies. I know about the money you stole from your mother before she died. I know everything you've tried to forget." She was right in front of me now, so close I could smell her, not the perfume you'd expect from a woman in a wedding dress, but something rotten and sweet like flowers left too long in a vase. "Look at me, Daniel. Look at me and I'll tell you how to fix it all. I'll tell you how to get Sarah back. I'll tell you how to make the shame go away. Just look at me." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight, and tears were running down my face because she was right about my mother, about money I'd taken from her account 3 days before she died. Telling myself it was technically my inheritance anyway, and I needed it more than she did because she was in hospice and wasn't going to need money where she was going, hating myself for the thought even as I did it. And I'd never told anyone about that, never confessed it to Sarah or to any of the therapists I'd briefly seen. And here was this thing in a wedding dress knowing my deepest shame and offering me a way out. I almost looked up. I almost met those black eyes. But at the last second, I remembered Eleanor's warning about Rule 1 being the least dangerous to break, but still dangerous enough to matter, and I forced myself to walk forward, keeping my eyes on the ground, walking right through the space where the woman in white was standing. For a moment, I was surrounded by that rotting flower smell, and I felt cold fingers brush against my face, my neck, my chest, like she was trying to grab me and pull me toward her. But then I was past her and she let out a sound that was half scream and half sob, and when I finally dared to look back, she was gone. The children came again at 12:43 a.m., and this time I was ready. I was already near the shed when I heard the first giggle, and I got inside and locked the door before the laughter became that terrible chorus of childish voices that seemed too old and too knowing to actually belong to children. They stayed longer this time. A full 40 minutes of scratching and laughing and something that sounded like whispering in a language I didn't recognize. when they finally left, I found small handprints on the outside of the windows, dozens of them, smudged into the dust and dirt like they'd been pressed there by wet palms. At 2 a.m., I made sure to keep my eyes firmly on the ground as I passed near the western wall, but I could hear them up there, the figures I'd seen the night before breathing in unison, a wet rattling sound like lungs full of water. At 2:34 a.m., while checking the northern section, I encountered Rule 4 for the first time. An old man approached me on one of the side paths, dressed in a neat suit and tie, carrying a bouquet of fresh carnations. He smiled pleasantly and asked if I could help him find his daughter's grave. Emma Patterson died in 1956 at the age of 7. I remembered the rule and casually swept my flashlight beam across the ground near his feet. The lamppost 10 feet behind him cast a clear shadow from a nearby headstone, but the old man cast no shadow at all. My light passed right through the space where his shadow should have been and hit the ground uninterrupted. I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to smile back and pointed toward the eastern section, the opposite direction from where the 1950s graves were actually located. "That way, sir," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "About halfway down the main path, then take the third left." The old man thanked me warmly, tipped an invisible hat, and walked off in the direction I'd indicated. After about 20 steps, he simply faded away, becoming transparent and then disappearing entirely, his carnations dropping to the ground where they immediately withered and turned black. I went over and looked at them with my flashlight. They crumbled to dust when I touched them with my shoe. The next 3 hours passed slowly but without major incident. I stayed away from the chapel, kept my eyes down near the western wall, and didn't acknowledge the woman in white when she appeared 2 more times, once standing in the middle of a family plot, and once sitting on top of a large marble tomb, swinging her legs like a child and humming a song I almost recognized. At 5:30 a.m., with half an hour left in my shift, I was beginning to think I'd make it through another night unscathed. That's when I smelled the roses. Fresh, sweet, overwhelming, like I'd walked into a flower shop. I froze in the middle of the path, Rule 8 screaming in my mind. If you smell fresh roses at any time during your shift, you are being followed. Do not turn around for exactly 10 minutes. Count slowly. Every instinct in my body wanted to turn around to see what was behind me, but I started counting instead. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, forcing myself to walk slowly forward, not running, not looking back, just counting and trying not to think about what might be following me. At 4 minutes, I felt hot breath on the back of my neck. At 6 minutes, I heard footsteps behind me that matched mine exactly, stopping when I stopped, starting when I started. At 8 minutes, something touched my shoulder, and I felt fingers that were too long and had too many joints. At 9 minutes and 45 seconds, I heard a voice right next to my ear, so close I should have been able to feel lips touching my skin, whispering, "Turn around, Daniel. I want to show you something beautiful." I made it to 10 minutes, and the smell of roses vanished instantly, along with the presence behind me. I turned around slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw nothing but empty graves and hanging moss and shadows. But on the path where I'd been walking, where the thing had been following me, there were footprints. Not human footprints. These were something else, something with too many toes, something that left marks in the dirt that were wrong, that hurt to look at, that made my eyes water and my head ache when I tried to focus on them. Eleanor found me sitting on the steps of the shed at 6 a.m., staring at nothing, the envelope of cash sitting unopened in my lap. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You followed Rule 8. Good. Most people don't. Most people turn around." She didn't say what happened to the people who turned around, and I didn't ask. I took my money and went home and slept for 12 hours straight, dreaming of white dresses and black eyes and children who laughed in the dark. I should have quit after that second night. Any rational person would have quit. But I needed the money, and more than that, I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't a coward, that I could follow the rules and survive this job and maybe, just maybe, reclaim some small piece of self-respect. So I came back for night 3 and night 4 and night 5, and each night I learned something new about Magnolia Rest Cemetery and the things that walked there after dark. On the third night, I finally saw what was on top of the western wall clearly. They weren't standing on the wall. They were part of it, pressed into the bricks like flowers pressed into a book, their bodies flattened and distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the yellow fever victims, I realized. buried in mass graves behind the wall in 1867. And somehow Silas Blackwood's experiments had trapped them there, unable to move on, unable to rest, just watching and waiting and screaming silently for someone to help them. But there was nothing I could do, and Rule 3 was clear: don't look at them. Especially not between 2 and 3 a.m. when they were most active, when their trapped spirits had the most power to reach out and drag the living into the wall with them. On the fourth night, I heard the voice from inside the chapel. It was a young woman screaming for help, pounding on the inside of the door, begging to be let out. "Please," she screamed. "He's coming back. He's going to hurt me again. Please, you have to open the door." I stood outside the chapel for 15 minutes, my hand on the chains, every moral fiber of my being screaming at me to help her, to break Rule 5 and open the door. But I remembered what Eleanor had said about Tommy Bridger, about the folded uniform and the body that was never found, and I forced myself to walk away. The screaming followed me halfway across the cemetery, then stopped abruptly, replaced by low male laughter that seemed to come from inside the chapel's walls. On the fifth night, I made a mistake. I was tired, so tired after 5 days of sleeping during the day and working through the night. My circadian rhythm completely destroyed, my judgment impaired by exhaustion and stress. At 3:45 a.m., while walking past the northeast corner, I saw the grave with the red X. The paint was fresh, bright red against the weathered gray stone, and I stopped despite Rule 7's warning. I told myself I wouldn't read the inscription. I'd just look at the grave. Just see what was so dangerous about this particular plot. The headstone was simple, just a rectangle of granite with rounded edges, and there was no name on it. Instead, carved into the stone in letters that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them directly, was a single sentence in Latin. I don't speak Latin, don't know more than a handful of words in the language, but when I looked at that sentence, I understood it perfectly. The meaning forcing itself into my mind like a hand pushing through a door I'd been trying to hold closed. The inscription said, "Here lies the one who opened the way. Here lies the one who could not close it. Here lies Silas Blackwood, and here he waits to return." The moment I finished reading, the ground beneath my feet shifted, and I heard a sound like something large taking a deep breath, inhaling from beneath the earth. The red X on the headstone began to glow, pulsing like a heartbeat, and I felt something vast and old and hungry turn its attention toward me from somewhere far below. I ran. I didn't walk quickly or calmly retreat. I ran full speed back to the shed and locked myself inside and didn't come out until Eleanor arrived at dawn. She took one look at my face and said, "You read the inscription." It wasn't a question. I nodded, too shaken to lie. She closed her eyes and sighed deeply. "Damn it. I was hoping you'd make it longer before that happened." She opened her eyes and looked at me with something like pity. "You've marked yourself now, Daniel. Blackwood knows you're here. He'll test you harder now, try to find a way to use you. The rules become even more important. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and he'll use you to open the door he's been trying to open for 150 years. I asked her what door she meant, what Silas Blackwood wanted, but she just shook her head. "The less you know, the safer you are. Just follow the rules, Daniel. That's all you need to do. Follow the rules and survive until dawn." She paid me and left, and I went home and seriously considered never coming back, finding a different job, leaving Savannah entirely if I had to. But that night, as I was lying in bed trying to sleep, I felt it. A presence in my apartment watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to fall asleep. The smell of roses filled the air, and I heard children laughing somewhere in the building, and I realized that Eleanor was right. I'd marked myself. Whatever was in Magnolia Rest Cemetery had noticed me, and it wasn't going to let me go just because I quit the job. So I went back for night 6 and night 7 and night 8, and each night the encounters became more intense, more personal, more dangerous. The woman in white dress started appearing in places she shouldn't be able to reach. Inside the locked shed, reflected in the windows of my car, standing in the middle of the main path just after sunset when I arrived for my shift. She never spoke anymore, just watched me with those black eyes and smiled a sad smile that promised terrible things. The children came every night now, their laughter starting earlier and lasting longer, their scratching at the shed more frantic and determined. The figures in the wall began reaching out during the forbidden hour between 2 and 3 a.m., their flattened hands stretching impossibly far from the bricks, trying to grab anyone foolish enough to look at them. and I started seeing new things, things that weren't covered by the rules. I saw a man hanging from one of the oak trees, swaying gently in a breeze that didn't exist, his face purple and bloated, his eyes following me as I passed beneath him. I saw a woman kneeling beside a child's grave, weeping silently, and when I got close enough, I realized she was crying blood that stained the grass black. I saw shadows that moved independently of any light source, crawling along the ground like living things, pooling in corners and beneath headstones, watching me with invisible eyes. On night 10, something changed. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. as usual, but Eleanor wasn't there. Instead, there was a note taped to the shed door in her precise handwriting. Family emergency. You're on your own tonight. Remember the rules. Under no circumstances should you deviate from them. If you survive until dawn, there's a bonus envelope in the shed's lockbox. Code is 1846, good luck. I unlocked the shed and found the lockbox, a small metal safe bolted to the floor beneath the workbench. I entered the code 1846, Silas Blackwood's year of death, and found an envelope containing an extra $500 along with a 9th rule written on a separate card. If Eleanor is not here when your shift ends, do not leave the cemetery until full daylight at 7 a.m. Wait in the shed with the door locked. Do not respond to anyone claiming to be Eleanor before full daylight. That 9th rule made my skin crawl, but I pocketed the money and started my shift. The cemetery felt different that night, more active. Like the things that lived there knew I was alone without Eleanor's protection. The woman in white appeared before I'd even finished my first patrol of the main path, standing directly in front of me with her arms spread wide, blocking my way. I kept my eyes down and walked around her, but she moved with me, staying in my path, forcing me to navigate around headstones and through family plots to avoid her. She followed me for 2 hours, always just at the edge of my vision, sometimes walking, sometimes floating, sometimes crawling on her hands and knees like a spider, her wedding dress dragging through the dirt and grass. At midnight exactly, the children came, but this time they were different. I could see them, not clearly, not as solid forms, but as flickering translucent shapes that ran between the graves, their bodies wrong in ways that hurt to think about. Too many limbs, joints that bent in impossible directions, faces that were almost human but not quite, mouths full of too many teeth. They chased each other in some mockery of a childhood game, laughing and shrieking, and when they saw me watching from the shed window, they all stopped simultaneously and turned to stare at me with eyes that glowed in the darkness like dying fireflies. Then they ran toward the shed in a pack, and I heard them hit the door and walls with the force of sledgehammers. The whole structure shook. The windows cracked. One of the children, a little girl in a dress that might have been white 100 years ago, pressed her face against the window, her features smashing flat against the glass, her mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal a throat that went down and down and down into depths that couldn't possibly fit inside a child-sized body. They stayed for over an hour, trying to break in, trying to force their way through the door and windows. And I genuinely believed I was going to die in that shed. But the structure held. When they finally lost interest and skittered off into the darkness, I found bloody handprints covering every surface of the shed's exterior. Hundreds of them, overlapping, some small as an infant's and some large as an adult's, all red and fresh and impossible. At 2:15 a.m. I made my biggest mistake. I was exhausted, terrified, and not thinking clearly. I needed to use the bathroom. There wasn't one in the shed, and I'd been holding it for hours, and I couldn't wait anymore. I stepped outside, walked quickly to a secluded spot behind the shed, and in my desperate rush, I completely forgot about Rule 3. I forgot that it was the forbidden hour, the time when I was supposed to keep my eyes away from the western wall no matter what. As I finished and turned to go back to the shed, my gaze swept across the cemetery and I looked directly at the western wall. The figures pressed into the bricks were moving, not just reaching out like they had on previous nights, but actively pulling themselves free from the stone, peeling away from the wall like photographs being lifted from a page. They were screaming now, not silently but with voices that sounded like grinding stone and tearing metal, and they were looking at me, all of them. Dozens of flattened faces with hollow eyes fixed on the idiot who had looked at them during the 1 hour when they had the power to act. One of them, a woman in a dress from the 1860s, managed to pull her entire upper body free from the wall and reach toward me with arms that stretched and stretched. growing longer as they crossed the distance between us, fingers like branches scraping through the air. I ran back to the shed and slammed the door, but I could hear them coming, dragging themselves across the ground, their flattened bodies making wet sliding sounds on the grass and gravel. They surrounded the shed, and unlike the children who had eventually given up, these things were patient. They pressed themselves against the walls and door and windows, and I could feel the wood beginning to buckle under their weight. Could see the boards beginning to warp and crack. One of them found a gap between the door and the frame, and I watched in horror as a flattened hand, crushed to the thickness of paper but still somehow functioning, began to slide through the gap, fingers wriggling like worms. I grabbed a hammer from the tool rack and smashed at the hand, but it was like hitting leather. It compressed under the blows but didn't break, didn't bleed, just kept pushing through. More hands found more gaps, sliding through cracks I hadn't known existed, and I realized with absolute certainty that the shed was not going to hold. That I had maybe 5 minutes before these things forced their way inside and pulled me back to the wall with them, pressed me into the bricks like a butterfly pinned to a board, trapped there forever with my mouth open in a silent scream. That's when I remembered the sage and salt Eleanor had given me on my second night. I'd kept them in my jacket pocket, had almost forgotten about them, but now I dumped the contents on the floor bundle of dried sage and a small canvas bag of coarse salt. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with them, had no idea if there was a proper ritual or spell, so I did the only thing I could think of. I lit the sage bundle with my lighter and waved it around the inside of the shed, letting the smoke fill the small space, and I poured the salt in a line across the threshold of the door and along the windowsills. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The hands that had been pushing through the gaps recoiled as if burned, and the pressure on the walls eased. The grinding screaming sounds retreated, growing fainter, and through the smoke-hazed windows, I could see the flattened figures dragging themselves back toward the wall, returning to their prison in the bricks. By 3:15 a.m. they were all back, pressed into the stone once again, and the cemetery was quiet except for the pounding of my own heart. I sat in the shed for the rest of the night, keeping the sage burning, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes crawl by with agonizing slowness. 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m. Eleanor's note had said not to leave until full daylight at 7 a.m., and I was going to follow that instruction exactly. At 6:30 a.m., I heard a car pull up outside the gates and footsteps approaching the shed. A woman's voice called out, "Daniel? You can come out now. It's Eleanor. Your shift is over." I looked at my phone. 6:42 a.m., not full daylight yet. The sun was rising, but it hadn't fully cleared the horizon. I remembered the 9th rule, though, not respond to anyone claiming to be Eleanor before full daylight. "I'm fine," I called back through the door. "I'll be out at 7. There was a long pause, then the voice said, "Don't be silly. You've had a rough night. Come on out and I'll drive you home." The voice was perfect, exactly like Eleanor's, but something about it felt wrong. Too smooth, too friendly. The real Eleanor had never offered to drive me anywhere. "I'll wait until 7, I repeated, my voice shaking. "Thanks anyway." Another pause, longer this time, then the voice changed. It stayed Eleanor's voice, but the tone shifted, became colder, harder. "You broke Rule 3 tonight, Daniel." You looked at the wall. "You know what that means. The only reason you're still alive is because you're protected in there. But you have to come out eventually. Silas is waiting for you. He's been waiting so long, and you're going to help him finish what he started." I didn't respond. I sat in the corner of the shed, breathing sage smoke, watching the door handle slowly turn back and forth as whatever was outside tested it. And I waited. At 7:03 a.m., with full daylight streaming through the windows, I heard the thing outside make a sound of frustration and rage that definitely didn't come from Eleanor's throat, then footsteps retreating. I waited another 10 minutes to be safe, then carefully opened the door. The cemetery looked peaceful in the morning light, almost beautiful. With the sun filtering through the Spanish moss and birds singing in the oak trees, there was no sign of the night's horrors, no bloody handprints or disturbed ground near the western wall. Nothing to suggest that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But when I looked down at the threshold of the shed, I saw scorch marks in the wood where the salt line had been, and my hands were still shaking. The real Eleanor arrived at 7:30 a.m., parking her Lincoln at the gate and walking up to the shed where I was still sitting on the steps, too exhausted to move. She looked me over carefully, noting the sage bundle still clutched in my hand and the fear in my eyes. "You broke Rule 3, she said flatly. I nodded, too tired to lie. "But you survived. That's impressive. Most people who break that rule don't see morning, and you figured out the sage and salt on your own. Very impressive." She handed me my envelope of cash plus the bonus she'd promised. "Take a few days off, Daniel. You've earned it. But when you come back, I need to tell you the truth about this place, all of it. You're in too deep now to work here without understanding what you're protecting." I took the money and went home, and I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. I ordered delivery food, kept the lights on constantly, burned sage in every corner of the rooms, and tried to process what I'd experienced. On the 4th day, Eleanor called me. "We need to talk," she said. "Meet me at the Griffin Tea Room at noon. Public place, daylight, you'll be safe." I met her at the restaurant, a beautiful old building in downtown Savannah with high ceilings and elegant furniture that seemed a million miles away from the horror of Magnolia Rest. Eleanor ordered tea. I ordered coffee I couldn't drink, and she told me the truth. "Silas Blackwood was my great-great-grandfather," she began. "He was a wealthy man, owned the plantation that became the cemetery, and when his wife died in childbirth in 1844, he became obsessed with bringing her back. He studied spiritualism, occultism, anything he thought might let him communicate with the dead. In 1846, he succeeded, or at least he thought he did. He opened a door, a thin place between our world and whatever lies beyond death, and something came through, not his wife. Something that pretended to be his wife, that wore her face and spoke with her voice, but wasn't her." Eleanor paused to sip her tea, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. The only sign that this story affected her. Silas realized too late what he'd done. The thing that came through started changing the cemetery, started trapping the spirits of the newly dead, feeding on them, growing stronger. Silas tried to close the door, tried to undo what he'd done, but he couldn't. The best he could manage was to bind the entity to the cemetery grounds, to create rules that would limit its power, and to sacrifice himself to serve as an anchor for those rules. He was buried in that grave you found, the one with the red X, and his body serves as a seal. As long as his grave is undisturbed, as long as the rules are followed, the entity stays contained. But it's getting stronger, Eleanor continued. Every few years it tests the boundaries more aggressively, tries to break free. It needs someone living, someone who works in the cemetery and has regular access to open Silas's grave and break the seal. That's what happened to Tommy Bridger. He broke too many rules, got marked by the entity, and eventually it convinced him to open the chapel where Silas used to conduct his rituals. Tommy tried to dig up the grave with the red X. We found the shovel next to the headstone, but no Tommy. The entity took him, added him to its collection of trapped spirits. I finally found my voice. "Why are you telling me this? Why not just close the cemetery, bury everything, walk away?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because we can't. The entity is bound to the land itself, not just the cemetery. If we closed Magnolia Rest, it would still be there. Still be trapping spirits, but there would be no one following the rules, no one maintaining Silas's protections. It would grow stronger unchecked until it could break free on its own. The Blackwood family has been maintaining this cemetery for almost 200 years, each generation taking responsibility for containing what our ancestor unleashed. I'm 72 years old, Daniel. I don't have many years left. I need to know that when I'm gone, someone else will understand what's at stake and keep following the rules." She looked at me intently. "You're strong, Daniel. Stronger than you give yourself credit for. You broke Rule 3, one of the most dangerous rules, during the worst possible hour, and you survived because you didn't panic, because you remembered the sage and salt, because you followed the 9th rule even when the entity was pretending to be me. I've been doing this for 50 years, and I've only seen a handful of people with that kind of discipline and intuition. I'm not asking you to take over the cemetery when I'm gone, that's still years away. Hopefully. But I am asking you to keep working the night shift, to keep learning, to be ready if I need you to do more than just follow the rules." I should have said no. I should have taken my money, quit the job, and moved as far from Savannah as I could get. But Eleanor was right about one thing. I was in too deep now. The entity had noticed me, marked me, and based on the things I'd been seeing in my apartment during my nights off, it wasn't going to leave me alone just because I quit. If I was going to be haunted anyway, I might as well get paid for it and maybe actually accomplish something meaningful by helping to keep this thing contained. So I said yes. I told Eleanor I'd come back. I'd keep following the rules and I'd learn whatever she thought I needed to know. That was 4 months ago. I've worked at Magnolia Rest Cemetery 5 nights a week ever since, and I've learned more than I ever wanted to know about the entity that haunts it. Eleanor has taught me the proper rituals for using sage and salt, has shown me the symbols carved into certain headstones that mark the boundaries of the entity's prison, has explained the significance of each rule and what happens when they're broken. Rule 1 exists because the woman in white is the entity's primary lure. Its most convincing mask, and acknowledging her gives her power over you, lets her into your mind where she can manipulate your fears and desires. Rule 2 protects you from the children, which aren't really children at all but fragments of the entity, pieces it splits off to hunt and gather fear. Rule 3 keeps you safe from the yellow fever victims who were trapped in the wall by Silas's first failed attempts to close the door he'd opened. Rule 4 helps you identify spirits that have been fully consumed by the entity, the ones with no shadows because they no longer have any connection to life or light, and giving them wrong directions prevents them from finding and possessing the living who visit the cemetery during the day. Rule 5 protects the chapel, which is the original site where Silas opened the door and where the door is still thinnest, most vulnerable to being opened again. Rule 6 is about your vehicle because the entity will try to lure you out of the cemetery before your shift ends, before dawn breaks its power, and if you leave early, you take a piece of it with you. Rule 7 protects Silas's grave from being disturbed, which would break the seal entirely. And Rule 8, the most important rule, the one Eleanor says must never be broken under any circumstances, exists because the smell of roses means the entity itself is following you in its true form, and if you turn around and see it, if you look directly at its real shape, you'll go mad instantly and become its willing servant. I've followed the rules religiously since that terrible 10th night. I've watched the woman in white appear in increasingly desperate forms, sometimes as my dead mother, sometimes as Sarah, sometimes as versions of myself, showing me the life I could have had if I'd made better choices. I've hidden in the shed while the children tried to break in, and the yellow fever victims pressed against the walls. I've given wrong directions to shadowless spirits and ignored screams from the chapel, and watched my car's lights turn on by themselves from the safety of the shed. And 3 more times I've smelled the roses and counted to 10 minutes without turning around, feeling that terrible presence right behind me, hearing it whisper promises and threats in a voice that sounds like everyone I've ever loved, and everyone I've ever feared all speaking at once. But I've survived every night. I've collected my pay. I've learned the rituals and the history. And slowly, painfully, I've started to rebuild my life. I'm seeing a therapist now, one who specializes in trauma, though I obviously can't tell her what I'm really traumatized by. I've been attending regular 12-step meetings for my gambling addiction. I've been saving money for the first time in years. And last week, I finally worked up the courage to call Sarah. We met for coffee and I apologized for everything. The lies, the theft, the betrayal of her trust. I didn't expect her to forgive me, didn't expect anything from her, but I needed to say it anyway. She listened and said she appreciated the apology, but she'd moved on, met someone new, was building a life without me in it. It hurt to hear, but it was a clean hurt, the kind that comes from closing a wound properly instead of leaving it to fester. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. Working at Magnolia Rest has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm more careful now, more aware of consequences, more willing to follow rules even when they don't make immediate sense. I've learned that there are things in this world that are bigger and more dangerous than my personal problems. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up night after night and face your fears without running. I've learned that shame and guilt are heavy burdens, but they're not as heavy as letting an ancient evil escape because you were too weak or too selfish to do your job. Eleanor says I'm ready to learn the final lesson, the one she's been saving for when she was sure I wouldn't break under the pressure. There's a way to strengthen Silas's seal, to reinforce the rules and push the entity deeper into its prison for another generation. But it requires a sacrifice, not death, Eleanor assures me, but something else, something permanent. She won't tell me exactly what until I agree to do it, but she's hinted that it's similar to what happened to her, to why she spent 50 years maintaining the cemetery, to why she can never really leave Savannah even though she's wanted to for decades. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to do it. Part of me wants to refuse, wants to keep working the night shifts but not commit to anything more. to eventually save enough money to leave Savannah and let someone else deal with Magnolia Rest and its horrors. But another part of me, the part that's been growing stronger over these months, the part that survived the woman in white and the children and the things in the wall, that part of me knows I'm going to say yes. Because Eleanor is right. Someone has to do this. Someone has to stand between the darkness and the unsuspecting world. And maybe, just maybe, this is my chance at real redemption. Not just for the lies I told Sarah or the money I stole from my dying mother, but for all the years I spent being weak and selfish and afraid. Tonight is my 78th night shift at Magnolia Rest Cemetery. I'll arrive at 9:45 p.m., park my Honda Civic outside the iron gates, and walk through the darkness to the maintenance shed where Eleanor will be waiting. I'll take my keys and my flashlight and my laminated card of rules. I'll burn sage and carry salt, and remember that the woman in white cannot hurt me if I don't acknowledge her, that the children cannot catch me if I reach the shed in time, that the yellow fever victims cannot pull me into the wall if I keep my eyes down between 2 and 3 a.m., that the shadowless spirits cannot possess me if I send them the wrong way, that the chapel must stay locked no matter who screams from inside, that my car will be there in the morning if I'm patient enough to wait, that Silas's grave must never be disturbed, and that if I smell roses I must never ever turn around. And maybe tonight I'll tell Eleanor I'm ready to learn the final lesson. Maybe tonight I'll agree to make whatever sacrifice is necessary to keep the entity contained for another generation. Or maybe I'll wait a little longer, work a few more shifts, save a little more money, cling to the possibility that I might still escape this place and build a normal life somewhere far from Savannah and its ghosts. But deep down I already know the truth. I've known it since that 10th night when I broke Rule 3 and survived. Since Eleanor told me about Silas Blackwood and the door he opened. Since I realized that the entity's attention would follow me wherever I went, unless I did something to stop it. I'm not leaving Magnolia Rest. This cemetery is my penance and my purpose, my punishment and my redemption. The rules that govern this place have become the rules that govern my life, and in a strange way, that clarity is almost comforting. I know what's expected of me. I know what happens if I fail. And I know that every night I show up, every night I follow the rules and survive until dawn, I'm doing something that matters. So tonight I'll go back, and tomorrow night. And the night after that, I'll walk the paths between the graves, I'll hide from the children, I'll avoid the woman in white, I'll keep my eyes down near the western wall, and I'll count slowly when I smell the roses. I'll do this for as long as Eleanor needs me. And when she's gone, I'll do it for whoever comes after her. Because someone has to work the night shift at Magnolia Rest Cemetery. Someone has to follow the rules. Someone has to stand guard over the door that Silas Blackwood opened and couldn't close, to make sure that the thing on the other side never breaks free. That someone is me. Daniel Reed, 28 years old, former liar and coward, now the night caretaker of Magnolia Rest Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, keeper of the rules, survivor of the darkness, guardian of a secret that the world can never know. It's not the life I imagined for myself. It's not the redemption I would have chosen, but it's the life I have, and for the first time in years, I'm not running from it. The sun is setting. It's almost 9:45 p.m., time to go to work.